critical to my feeling of this is possible, this is what I want to do. So I think that's irreplaceable. So thank you so much for all the research you've done. Most of my talk today will be about my book, Feeding Iran Shia Families and the Making of the Islamic Republic. But I also wanted to sort of just comment really quickly on the origins of my work and the reasons I did my fieldwork in Iran and how they kind of relate in some way to the current crisis unfolding with Israel and Palestine. So for the most part, I wanted to think about how I began my work in Iran with sort of, I went to college in, I started college in 2001. So 9/11 happened my first year of undergrad. And it sort of helped propel me into the study of things like Arabic, Persian, and sort of made me aware of this part of the world. It didn't hurt that my roommate happened to be Iranian, but that's a different story. And so I sort of become aware, and I wanted to bring a more humanistic understanding of people in this part of the world beyond the sensationalist headlines. So even today, you see all these headlines in the news, but what are people's lives really like? How can we really have a better understanding of their world, their aspirations, and just all the messiness of human life? And so I wanted to kind of bring that to the fore. So I went about heading toward graduate school to do this kind of research. Notably, 9/11 wasn't the beginning of anti-Muslim racism, but it sort of did propel me. A quick point here also is I wanted to sort of advocate the book of a fellow anthropologist, Wellman, who did work on Palestine. It's called Life Lived in Relief. So if you want an approach that's an anthropological approach to the lives of Palestinians and Palestinian refugees, then you can check that out. So I would just call that forward. So this might look familiar today, right now, but it's not. This is from 2015. On November 12, 2015, an ISIS bombing claimed dozens of lives and injured many more in a bustling neighborhood in Beirut. The Lebanese Shi'i community is also home to Palestinian, Lebanese Christians, and Kurdish populations, among others. Then, days later, ISIS struck again, this time in the trendy North Paris neighborhood of Saint-Denis. And that day, shootings and suicide bombings took more than 100 lives, making it one of the deadliest attacks in France since World War II. As we see right now, too, social media became a channel of global outcry and grief in support of the people in Paris. In contrast, internationally, the Beirut attacks garnered far less attention. Some have advocated understanding this as an empathy gap. And this term was coined by David Graham of The Atlantic, and he offered it to describe why many Americans could easily see themselves as victims of the Paris attack, but not of the Beirut attack. So he's trying to think about this asymmetry, and he hypothesized, for most Americans, Beirut is in Paris. But another initial theory, and this one may be more accurate, is learned ignorance. And that's the idea that the facts we know aren't just learned, they're produced. And I always think of Rosa Parks and the story of her being a tired old lady on the school bus when really she was an activist. So how we understand facts and how they're produced is important. But I also I'm sure you all already know this stuff, but I just wanted to call it to the front of our minds right now in this moment as we begin this talk, because there's another possibility for understanding these media biases that we're seeing in power dynamics that are getting obscured, and that's Orientalism. And the main components of Orientalism, you probably know this, but it involves this quintessential other in the Muslim, seeing the Muslim as a quintessential other, rendered as exotic, irrational, barbaric. And this divide between East and West is not a national divide, but one that we made. So this is his theory of Orientalism. And importantly, Orientalism is a very coherent and consistent theory. And thinking about it allows us to see how it's been ongoing. It's got tremendous internal consistency and coherence. And again, we can see it today. And this is how many people also approach Iran. The final part of this, quick, before my talk, is thinking about Islamophobia. Many people use this term. If you want to translate it directly, it's like fear of Islam, but that sort of makes it sound like a phobia, like arachnophobia or something like that. And many scholars have moved toward calling this anti-Muslim racism and thinking about the more systemic aspects of Islamophobia, like there's an Islamophobia funding network and things like that. So sort of being more aware of that. And also that it's not just about the individual hate crimes and acts, although those are important, but it's systemic. So thinking about it more in that kind of way. Mustafa Bayoumi has written about this, and he says, Islamophobia as anti-Muslim racism more accurately reflects the intersection of race and religion as a reality of structural inequality and violence rooted in the longer history of U.S. empire building. So just sort of keeping that in mind. And by looking at this, by keeping it front and center, we can challenge the idea that the problem is an individual bias and so on and so forth. So it's really important, and I think it's sort of just good to keep with us as what we, sort of what we're seeing today. Now the same kind of thing happened, as I mentioned earlier, to kind of get me going in this research in Iran. I was interested in moving beyond the sensationalist headlines, sort of went in with that in mind, and similar things happened since, I mean, if you think back to the 2009 Iranian presidential election protests, or the 2015 Iran nuclear deal and its dissolution under Trump, or anything sort of this enemy other that Iran has been made to be in the news and things like that, since the 1979 hostage crisis, if not before, these things are very much part of this, and if we look at them, we can see that all most Americans know about are the headlines in the news, if not hardly even that, right? Like they don't even know where Iran is on the map and things like that. So just sort of keeping that forward. Okay, so my book, Feeding Iran Shia Families and the Making of the Islamic Republic, was published by the University of California Press in June of 2021. And in part, it's an attempt to confront and shift these narratives, although it's not really explicitly that in the book itself, but that's where I came from originally. So I'm an anthropologist, and the book draws from about a year and a half of ethnographic research in Iran, which I conducted between 2007 and 2010. So it was actually 2 long summers in Iran and about a year of living in Iran as well. So it focused on a couple key questions that I developed during my undergraduate research. Some of these will be familiar to you, some of them might be a little bit different. The first is, how can we think about kinship beyond a genealogical frame in and across the Middle East, and especially in Iran? So what else makes kinship? So just people would write about the Middle East and they just assume patrilineal, matrilineal, or mostly patrilineal. They assume certain understandings of the family, about how people are related, about how people understand the family. I wanted to get beyond that and find out exactly what people actually said about their kin, how they really experienced and understood family and kinship. The second question that motivated this was how does religion and religiously informed ethics and values and rituals shape kinship and acts of kinship and shifting networks of kin? So really thinking about that intersection and sort of the everyday. How does it look like when I'm at home and I'm praying for my children? How is that a part of my religiosity? Not just the imams and what they're saying in the mosque, or what my religious government is saying, or anything like that, but what does it look like at home for people who are actually living religious lives there? And that led to my third question, which was probably the biggest question of my book: how does everyday piety and forms of intimacy in the home link to state power? So my ultimate argument is that they do, and we'll see that as we go forward. And this runs counter to some theories of modernity that assume that kinship is located in the home only, and it doesn't impact the state, or it has nothing to do with the government or nationalism or anything like that, but we can see that actually many models and forms of kinship do shape things like nationalism. And so I was interested in this, but I wasn't just interested in the way this is analogical, like the kinship is a small version of the nation. I was also interested in the actual tangible physical substances that were being made and understood at home and then were being used in the public sphere to shape Iran. So I was thinking about blood, I was thinking about food produced at home, how that appears in grand rituals of Iranian state power, and ideas of blood, but not just the symbol of blood, also the physical blood of martyrs, and how that moves from the family to the nation. Finally, I wanted to show the experiences and aspirations of everyday Shia Muslim Iranians who live in the provinces. So my research is a little unusual in the study of Iran, where many people have studied urban centers, but I wanted to look at, in the recent study, I would say, many people have studied urban centers. They focused a lot on the protesters, the people who are protesting the regime, and I wanted to kind of just look at a different population. So Shias claim that the son-in-law of the Prophet, Imam Ali, is the divinely appointed successor to Muhammad, and he is known as the first Imam. And then they extend this Imami doctrine to the Prophet's family and the 12 Imams who possess special religious and political authority. And this view differs from that of Sunni Muslims who believe that the Prophet did not appoint a successor before his death and consider Abu Bakr, who was appointed caliph by a group of senior Muslims, to be the first rightful caliph after the Prophet Muhammad. So that's just a little, people sometimes get mixed up when they don't understand that. So I just wanted to quickly clarify that. But Iran does not only have Shia Muslims, it has a percentage of Sunni Muslims, it has Jews living. There are actually quite I think maybe 60, 70 or more thousand Jews living in Iran. There are Zoroastrians and so on. So it's not a monotone, monolithic country by any means. My research was conducted in a town I call Farsabad. I use a pseudonym because I want to protect my interlocutors. Some of the things they told me were very sensitive, and some of the positions they hold are very sensitive. And in Iran, it's very important to protect people who may have spoken out against the status quo and things like that, so I needed to make sure that I protect my interlocutors. But this town is in the Fars province, which is a couple hours from Shiraz, and it had a population of about 20,000 people, and was well known for its factories, including pickling factories. So that's what people did in this town. There were people working in factories, they were farmers, things like that. I lived in a household with Ahmed, who was a veteran of the Iran-Iraq War, his wife Nushin, and their 4 children. Both Ahmed and Nushin were retired teachers and had been directors of the local boys and girls schools, respectively. They were landowners, and they now supplemented their pensions by farming and renting their land to extended kin. They might be described as members of what some have called a regime class in Iran. I also conducted research with their immediate neighbors and extended kin in Tehran and Shiraz, so their family was sort of spread out around Tehran, Shiraz, and this town. And I conducted research with all of those people, as well as their actual just unrelated neighbors. My research was also shaped by my host's religio-political affiliations, and they were members of the Basiji, at least in name. And by that I mean that they were connected to the Basiji, but they didn't actually go out and do military drills, or they weren't the morality police that you hear about on the TV or social media. They were really just kind of card-carrying members of the Basiji. And just a little background on the Basiji. The Basiji was founded in 1980 by Ayatollah Khomeini, and the organization was conceived of as the, quote, original revolutionaries who upheld the sacred defense of Iran during the Iran-Iraq War, which was from 1980 to 1988. They were the first in that war to go to the front and be martyred, though today the majority of Basiji, including my hosts, are inactive or regular members who merely continue to have ties to officialdom. And by this I mean my host Ahmed, for instance, had been mayor of the town for a couple of years. So he sort of knew people. He had fought in the Iran-Iraq War. He had sort of that orientation toward life. He wasn't, obviously he was alive, he wasn't a martyr, but he had sort of a network of people he had also been to war with, other veterans of the war that he associated with. And some of those also had political power and ties, and things like that. So my research is about kinship of kinship and how they were participating in state rituals, commemorations, and events. So how is this family, their friends, their relations participating in local events? And for them, many of the things they did, they told me, was to confront the problems they were facing in their society and the problems they imagined they were facing. So these included things like superficial piety. That was something we talked about a lot. Like not being pious on the inside and outside, just on the outside, right? And this is a way of Iranian understanding their personhood. They have an inside and an outside, and the best way is to have the two parts be the same. But they thought a lot of people were being sort of superficial about their piety, and so that was a big problem. Drug addiction was a problem they faced all the time. Divorce they were worried about, and they genuinely hoped to develop and create and be a part of a society that was harmonious, connected to God, sort of doing the right thing, and one that wasn't superficial. And they did this by striving to protect and care for their kin, for their family, through acts of care, through prayer, and they really wanted their kin to do well on the day of judgment, to be rewarded in the afterlife. They cared about all of that tremendously. And so this was occurring as the Islamic Republic is approaching its 4th decade, and we're really in a stage where some of the people in Iran, the majority of Iranians are quite young, and a lot of their children, my host family's children, weren't around to remember the Iran-Iraq War or the revolution. So they're of a different generation, and so it's all the more important that these values be instilled in the children. So a lot of my research was actually listening to the children and their views, and listening to the parents and their views, and trying to understand how the parents were trying to get their children to feel the same way they did and to understand the same things. And notably, there were differences, right? Like one brother was very religious, the other brother was off smoking hookah and riding his motorcycle and just having fun. I mean, this is what every family is like. We all have diversity, even among our own families. But the family was trying. So in particular, I focused on women. That was who I had access to for the most part, and how they understood this process, their practices of cooking and feeding, and how they did that on a daily basis to try to protect, feed their families nutritionally, but also protect them from any of these immoral issues that they could be facing. So one example of this is vow making, votive souffles. I talk about in my book a kind of ash, which is a soup called ash dandun, which is to help with teething for babies. In household contexts, usually these were performed to combat family fighting, feuds, drug use in the community, and other problems. And my attention to food is because in Iran, food is a central part of just family life and everything like that, but it's also a central part of religious practice. And many scholars have noted how it's a means of both somatic or bodily and spiritual incorporation. And it has the capacity to accrue value as it is cooked, as it is transformed through prayer or blessing. So food, particular food isn't innately blessed. It becomes blessed when you pray over it, or it gets kind of imbued in the blessing. Maybe it's cooked in a sacred space. Maybe it's cooked by people who are praying. These different things imbue the food with blessing. And one particular instance of this is called vow making, or nazri, and it involves the distribution of votive food to create blessing and fulfill personal vows to God or the Shi'i imams. Such vow making through prayer and cooking and feeding is an essential path for forging the right kind of blessed and pure kin relations, and thus of protecting kin. Even more, the labor of cooking votive food is itself a kind of labor through which one can accrue religious merit or savab, helping to ensure God's favor in this life and the next. And here I specifically brought up our Anne Betteridge, who has written that the way people relate to Shi'i imams in these contexts may be even closer than the way they relate to their own family members. So they're forming a relationship with the Shi'i imams, with God, through this work of cooking votive food and sharing it and so on. So it's a very intimate process. Kin relations can be formed through all kinds of things in the anthropology of kinship. not just blood and marriage, which is the things we assume. And anthropologists of kinship have looked at how kin relationships can be formed through processes of doing, such as care, nurturance, feeding, exchange, and making choices. Kin relations can also be tied to things that are immaterial, ethical, or sacred acts that work alongside or sometimes on their own to create kin relations. So we all know of like godparenthood and things like that as a form of spiritual kinship, but now some anthropologists are looking at how kin relations may be made through these kinds of acts like cooking blessed food and sharing it with family members. This relationship between food and kinship was significant in my fieldwork for a number of reasons. First, family members' shared qualities of temperament, character, blessing, and purity could be lost or developed. More than Islamic notions of kinship or background, these physio-sacred stuff of kinship was always shifting, an object of prayer, protection, and ethical work. To cultivate the right kind of family relationships, they ate together around the dining cloth or sofre, shared blessing, and they organized household rituals, completed with blessed food to protect and cleanse the family. This is a picture of my host Nushin at the tomb of a descendant of a Shi'i imam. And she prayed every day for the spiritual well-being and health of her family in the face of the rampant problems she and her family were facing, including the recent loss of her nephew to a heroin overdose. So this is about Ehsan, and he was buried on the Thursday after his death. His burial had been delayed a few days due to an ongoing investigation into the circumstance of his passing. So he was the cousin of, the nephew of Nushin. He was brought to the cemetery by ambulance in a wooden casket, and his close male relatives carried him up the hill to the earthen gravesite. Nearly 1,000 people attended the burial and the subsequent funeral. His immediate kin, both male and female, formed the first circle of mourners around the still open grave and then covered it with fresh earth. His sisters and mother cried and prayed. After the burial, they and their cousins distributed dates, fruits, and sweet wheat paste or halwa to the attendees. Then the mourners in a long car chain followed the sound of recitation of the Quran, broadcast from a truck decorated with a picture of Ehsan wreathed in flowers to Farsabad's meeting house for Imam Hussein. Inside the large carpeted hall, the Friday Imam spoke on the loudspeaker about the Day of Judgment to male and female mourners. A few months after Ehsan's burial, Nushin and I sat together drinking tea in her home in Farsabad. She folded her flowered cotton chador over her knees and confessed that she was worried that her two teenage sons, aged 19 and 23 respectively, what if they became drug addicts like Ehsan and died in the desert too? What if her husband also became an opium addict as he grew older, like Ehsan's father and her brother? Nushin's concerns were not limited to the high rates of opiate addiction in Farsabad and elsewhere in Iran, though. Family tensions were simmering for other reasons. Her young adult children, teenage brothers and sisters were arguing too much. What was more, she felt that she could not trust one of her husband's relatives who lived in the family old complex close to the center of town. Quote, "It's especially ugly when people belittle each other," she said, speaking about the tension between herself and one of these extended family members. Quote, "You have to be very good so that you can change yourself for someone else for the better." Yet perhaps because Nushin supported the regime and her husband and children were members of the Basiji, she did not fault the revolution for what she saw as an increasing fragmentation of kin relationships and Islamic family values in her society. Quote, "This is not because of the revolution. Khomeini and Khomeini are good," she told me on another occasion as she walked in the local park. "The problem is that others have surrendered hope." For me, Ehsan's story provides a way to talk about the experience of kinship in the Fars province. I explore how Nushin and her family, as well as their extended kin and neighbors, conceive of kinship as both a threat and a resource, employing their prayers and actions to protect and delineate their family households. Notably, they actually blame the U.S. for the incursion of drug and opiate problems in their town, saying that the U.S. was getting Afghanistan to import opioids to Iran. I don't know if that's true. I did not investigate that, but it's sort of interesting that they cast the blame that way. But in any case, in addition to all of this, this work in the family, So we're talking about food to protect kin from these sort of issues. We also see that they're distributing vast amounts of food to their neighbors and fellow townspeople at various times within the Islamic calendar. Birthdays of imams, Muharram, which is a month of mourning for the Imam Hussein who died at the Battle of Karbala. And they saw this distribution also as an attempt not just to bless and reshape their families and protect their families, but also the wider community. And they participated in Islamic national rituals that similarly emphasized the values of moral and pure kinship. So they sort of brought those values out into the public sphere where they were looking at things like, this is a picture of a martyrs commemoration in the town where I was doing my research. You can see that there are several women lined up with pictures of their martyred sons there. And interestingly, none of these women were the mothers of the martyrs. They were near other mothers of martyrs. The martyrs that were being buried were anonymous. They did not know the parentage of the martyrs that were being buried. And these martyrs have been unburied from the battlefield of Iran and the Iraq border and brought to the town in order to sacralize the landscape. That's something I argue in this book. But it's also interesting because, how did my host participate in this event? They went there, they were weeping for these women and their sons and for the unknown martyrs. And all the while, interestingly, the state was also involved in distributing less food. So now soldiers are at this event distributing rice, lentils, yogurt. They're doing it in military fatigue. They're calling the people present brothers and sisters of Islam. And so that notion of kinship and the food that's being used is being sort of exported into this setting of this state ritual to powerful effect. And for me, this event and others like it raise questions about the resonance between the family and the Islamically oriented state of Iran, and how state elites are co-opting family emotions, practices, and home religious practices, including their foodways, to legitimize a certain form of citizenship. And I talk about this a little bit as it's definitely a hierarchical citizenship. It involves a lot of the same understandings of brother and sister relationships, parent and children relationships, and it's kind of being used to make it seem natural. And that's what we talk about when we think about naturalization, how things come to be made legitimate or given. One of the ways this is happening in Iran is through this distribution of food. This is just the way things are. We're brothers and sisters of Islam. I am your paternalistic government, and I'm supporting you through this food and this distribution of food. So food is a biomoral substance that can be produced and consumed, shared, or contained pure or impure, blessed or contaminated. And it has been critical to the political religious project of making ideal and pure kindred citizens in Iran. Women and men prepare food at home and bring it into public graveyards, streets, or other venues, an extension of the work of feeding the family. Even more than blood, food is a way of encouraging active participation in state ritual, which includes the enactment of kinship roles and responsibility and figures recipients of blessed food as brothers and sisters of Islam. So, just to sort of end, I want to talk about some of the things that, how I'm thinking about this and how my work is maybe contributing not just to the study of Iran, but to thinking about some more theoretical ideas. And one of those is how family piety and relationships link to state power. And I think this happens in a lot of ways, as I mentioned, but Anne McClintock talked about this way back in 1993, and she noted that the family offers a, quote, natural figure for sanctioning social hierarchy within a putative organic unity of interest. So that's interesting. In this book, I look at this idea and how ideas of naturalness and blood as forms of kin-making appear in the national sphere to shape this analogy between kin and state. But I go further to show how other practices of kin-making, like food and prayer at home, shape this analogy as well. Food, after all, helps people conceptualize and differentiate themselves in relation to others, and it resonates with the ideal of the pure and halal family. At home, the careful orchestration of food and prayer is the mediation of boundaries, of kinship and the forging of the right kind of interfamily relationships. The same occurs in public contact